mechanism by which free trade operates is sort of the critical question for understanding the relationship between the free trade regime and climate change. And that is that the free trade regime seeks to limit government intervention in the market, whereas the climate regime is going to require substantial government participation and intervention in order to address the market failure that is climate change, the social costs of greenhouse gas emissions. And so there's a fundamental tension that exists between those two things. And the cases that I've selected, as I said, have essentially been selected in order to demonstrate what type of government participation is the free trade regime saying constitutes illegal, intervention in a way that overly distorts markets and whatnot. So in 2009, the province of Ontario passes this bill. As I said, the impetus of it was from environmentalists who were interested in lowering the carbon footprint of the province. At that time, I think they were 70 or 80% dependent on coal energy, and so the idea was, how can Ontario lower its carbon footprint? And the idea was, well, we could use renewable energy, but the political alignment that was necessary in order to actually move that through the provincial government required that there be some benefits for poor communities. There needed to be an alliance, a blue-green alliance between the labor unions and the environmentalists, and so it ultimately was decided through the negotiation and political process that the way to do this was that to do this feed-in tariff program, which pays consumers for the electricity that they produce, and to do that in a way that required that a fair amount of, I think it's like 30% or 50%, of certain facilities actually be manufactured in Ontario. So the idea was, let's distribute the benefits of their genuine costs for installing this new system, and we wanted to make sure that the benefits were felt. And I didn't say this before, but I do think it's a critical point. When we talk a lot about the destruction of the manufacturing base in the United States and whatnot. And I read something the other day, and I can't verify the accuracy of this, but it is a reputable source, was saying that every manufacturing job supports 3 additional jobs. And so the idea that when you lose 150,000 manufacturing jobs, you're actually talking about a much greater number of jobs that are lost. So in these communities that are, again, part of the Canadian Rust Belt that suffered a departure of their manufacturing base after NAFTA and the World Trade Organization, these are the kinds of things that don't just create the manufacturing jobs, but actually serve as a new foundation for rebuilding their communities. And because this is oriented to generating electricity locally, it also helped the community's economy develop the resilience that it needs so that they're not dependent on U.S. coal and other sources for their energy. So as we said, so it's wildly successful. A ton of foreign investment flows in. It creates lots and lots of jobs in the first year and a half and is anticipated to continue to create jobs. And again, these are direct jobs that are created. So if the 3-to-1 multiplier effect that I was just mentioning is true, then when we say 50,000 jobs, we're actually talking about a much greater number of jobs and a much bigger boost to the local economy. So this all seemed to be a really good outcome. This was hailed by the Blue-Green Alliance types, the labor unions and the environmentalists, as exactly the type of policy that other places need to work on in order to address the climate crisis in a way that provides real economic benefits to the community, and perhaps more importantly, that creates the political alliances that are necessary to move legislatures in the direction of actually addressing the climate change issue head on. Unfortunately, Japan and the European Union each independently filed a WTO suit alleging that the buy local provisions of the feed-in tariff program constituted an unnecessary or illegal trade barrier. These agreements are built to eliminate tariff and other barriers to trade. Well, what Japan and the EU were alleging was that the buy local provisions in the feed-in tariff program, which was a core part of getting it passed, constituted an illegal barrier to trade. And they actually alleged a whole host of things, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, there's a fundamental principle in all these free trade things. It's called national treatment. And all national treatment means is that you can't give preferences to your producers and products and discriminate against foreign producers and products. And so what the EU and Japan are saying is that and it's funny that they were sort of making our argument for us And this gets, again, at that fundamental tension between the two regimes. What they were saying is that if you didn't have the buy local provisions, then you wouldn't have any of this renewable power. They're saying this is an example of a government distortion of the economy. And we're saying, yeah, exactly. It's a government distortion of the economy. We wouldn't have all this renewable power if it weren't for the buy local provisions. And again, a lot of people were really frustrated because the idea was that you shouldn't be discriminating against foreign companies or products. But of the $27 billion that was invested in Ontario's renewable energy program, a substantial amount of it was coming from foreign entities building and making things in Ontario. A vast majority of the profits were sailing overseas. So it wasn't like there was this preference for Canadian businesses. It was trying to build a more resilient green economy inside of Canada, or inside of Ontario. And this is something from the Sierra Club's briefing paper on this, and it's a really good briefing paper. If this case interests you, I totally recommend it. It's like maybe 4 or 5 pages long. And this is a quote. And I think WTO said, yeah, no buy local provision. That's contrary to this idea of national treatment, and you're going to need to eliminate it. You're going to need to bring yourself into compliance. This is the alliance of labor and environmentalists, or at least the dual benefits of climate change legislation, whereby we're producing renewable energy and creating green jobs, is really a foundational idea for how we're going to address climate change in a politically feasible way. And the WTO is at this point saying, is siding with Japan and the EU. And I'll say that the US filed a third-party brief and supported Japan and the EU in saying that they didn't think that this was an appropriate measure. And it's been really concerning to see the outfall of this. The US is considering a copycat suit against a buy local rule in India, which India, I don't know for those folks who know, but India's economy is almost wholly dependent on coal. It's apparently the country is coal rich, much more than the United States, but it's an extremely high sulfur coal. So in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions associated with their production in India, it's actually worse than what we have here. So coal production in India, especially with the population and substantial portions of the population yet to even receive electricity, so it's really an imperative for that government to be increasing its electrical output. So India went about something to try to deal with this, and now the US is going to file a copycat suit alleging essentially exactly what Japan and the EU did here. China is considering a suit against Germany. So you have this situation where now the WTO is being utilized as a tool to go after successful climate change legislation. So tremendously concerning. It would be possible, yes, to build all the facilities in Ontario with foreign-made goods. The problem is that you never would be installing those facilities with foreign-made goods because you wouldn't have been able to get the legislature to move forward because it would have cost too much money and provided too few benefits. Right. And so, yeah, so what Japan and the EU is saying, they're saying, well, we want to make them and sell them to Ontario. What Ontario is saying, you wouldn't sell them here anyway because unless we were producing them locally, we wouldn't be putting all this extra generation in. And the reality is probably somewhere in between, right? Ontario may be overplaying its hand. There may be some facilities that would have gone in, but certainly not the substantial number of megawatts that we've seen go in. So yes, you're right that it's a technical possibility. The problem is that what we need are strong alliances to put the climate change policies in place. And without the ability of saying we're going to create local jobs, you don't get to that point. You wouldn't have been able to create a program as robust as this without a political alliance that was dependent on the idea that putting in all this stuff was going to create local jobs. There are lots of people who don't care about climate change. All they want is jobs. We need those people on our team, I think, is what it comes down to. And I will say that the vast majority of union leaders that I've worked with, and I did an event with James P. Hoffa the other day, I did an event with the AFL trade person. These folks get it. They want to address climate change. They recognize it. But at the end of the day, what you need is you need the rank and file to be stepping up and saying, they're not saying, hey, we want climate change legislation. They're stepping up and saying, hey, we want jobs. And so that's the political alliance that's necessary. Canada has appealed the challenge. The way the WTO judicial system works is, it's kind of like it is here. There's a district court, which is, you know, the court of first instance, the place where you first go, and then there's an appeals court, and that's sort of the way that the WTO judicial system works. So this was by the district court, the initial court that hears these things, the trial court, and now they're going to send it up to the appeals court, and we don't have a decision there. So the WTO uses its own judicial system, and that's a really important factor to consider in a host of contexts. But yeah, the NAFTA and the WTO and all they don't, you know, there's no, the U.S. Constitution, the state of laws of the state of Oregon do not matter in these challenges. You know, there's a good chance that Ontario didn't even have anyone representing them at the WTO, that there was only somebody from the Canadian the federal government, which, if you know anything about Canadian politics, that is not the people you want to be trying to defend renewable energy legislation. And a lot of people actually felt, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds, but a lot of people felt, and I think a lot of people felt like the Canadians left a bunch of really good arguments on the table. They didn't argue them, and if there are other lawyers in the room, the judges can't consider arguments that the parties didn't raise. And so you look at the briefs that the Canadians filed, and there are several arguments that I think they just completely failed to make, and many people think it's because they didn't want to establish precedent that was going to come back to bite them in the butt in terms of a bunch of the tar sands development and whatnot. So really, really disappointing. And as I said, it isn't just this suit. Now the U.S. is filing against India, and China is filing against Germany. All of a sudden you're seeing the reasoning from these suits being used to target other renewable energy programs. So it's not just the Ontario program that is being affected by this, but numerous other programs. To be honest with you, the idea of a local purchasing preference is pretty much an obvious violation of the WTO. I don't think there was any question from the time the legislation was even proposed that it was going to be something that was going to get challenged. Now, the timing of the challenge and all of that, I have no idea what the strategy it was for Japan and the EU. But you know, when I first heard about this, I was like, oh, I mean, I'm glad. I think more people need to do that. In fact, there's been counties in California that have specifically written like GMO legislation to try to violate WTO law, to bring the fight home, because these things seem like they're going on elsewhere, but they aren't. This isn't a global fight, this is a local fight. This is quite literally local laws being challenged at the WTO. And the judges are trade lawyers. You know, there wasn't anyone who was an energy expert or a climate expert that was consulted in any of these. The only question was, what is the WTO law? And it was a bunch of trade lawyers acting as judges. And in some of the other independent or some of the other judicial venues like NAFTA and whatnot, the lawyers that serve as judges in other cases are actually serving as lawyers. So it's just this, basically you have a list of, I can't remember what the exact number is, it's a pretty small number, it's like 47 or 68 or something like that, people that you can select to be the judges. And so those folks are, and there's some interesting academic work in the legal world about there's actually, if you look at the seminal cases, there's really 10 people that are writing international trade law. That's essentially what it's come down to. There's 10 trade lawyers, and you can imagine that, you know, they don't go to Sierra Club meetings. So anyhow, so that's the basics of that. So this next one is, if you thought that case was concerning, this one's really going to get you. And I apologize, there is some good news at the end of that, at the end of this. Really, there is some good news. I think we're in a better position today than we have been in the last 15 years to stop this stuff. So I'll at least sort of preface the good news before I go into this, because this is scary. So the St. Lawrence River is part of the border between Canada and the U.S. Up in our northeast, they're southeast, and this is the Gulf of St. Lawrence. You're basically over the Atlantic. You're looking west. The Gulf of St. Lawrence it's the largest estuary ecosystem in the world. And it is because it's a fresh and saltwater mix that connects the entire Great Lakes basin to the Atlantic Ocean. From what I understand, it's just an incredible place for unique ecosystem assemblages, animal and plant interactions that just don't happen anywhere because it's connecting such a vast region and the two, both the fresh and the saltwater systems. It's also a place that, for many of the same reasons, because it connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, it's been a tremendously important resource for commercial and industrial interests, both for transportation and for actual industry, which needs a lot of water. And it's been the source of strife between commercial interests and environmental interests since, the 1950s or 60s. And so it's sort of a regular source of tension between the Chamber of Commerce and the Sierra Club for just to sort of throw representatives out there. The geology is such that the fresh water for a substantial portion of the East Coast comes from the aquifers that are beneath and associated with the St. Lawrence River. It also so happens, because of the geology, that there is a lot of gas under there that until the advent of fracking was essentially not accessible. But from what I've read, there's 181 trillion tons of gas down there, which sounds like a lot. My wife says I got a lot of gas. I don't think so. That's a lot of gas. And so when they started to frack this area, which, given what we've seen in Michigan recently, that was a surface spill into water, and we saw what happened. Now we're talking about putting chemicals underneath the ground where the water exists in its most pure state, and threatening millions and millions and millions of people. Major cities, 6 or 7 major cities. A water supply depends on this area. So again, I mentioned the Council of Canadians. Go Council of Canadians. The Council of Canadians started a campaign called No Frackin' Way, and it was a really powerful coalition. The provincial government in Quebec was pressured by the Council of Canadians, who held a bunch of meetings just like this and got people excited and told them about what fracking meant, and people stood up and said, hey, no fracking way, and they put a moratorium on new drilling. So they didn't stop people who already had permits to frack, but they at least stepped up and said, hey, no new drilling. Well, the Council of Canadians said, not good enough. They actually elected a new provincial legislature on the promise that these people would step in and say no fracking at all under the St. Lawrence River, and it was democracy in action. It worked. The people won when they became actual legislators and were no longer candidates. They did what they said they were going to do as candidates, and they put in place a total moratorium on fracking underneath the St. Lawrence River based upon the concerns that it's going to destroy the water supply. So it's like, yes, success, right? Well, I'm setting up a straw man, of course. Lone Pine Resources is a U.S. corporation with some permits to do some fracking underneath the St. Lawrence River, and they have filed a suit under NAFTA's Chapter 11, quite literally claiming that they have a right to mine. They are claiming that the moratorium represents an expropriation of their future profits, which they say violates NAFTA. So, under U.S. takings law, if someone takes your lawn because they expanded the freeway, or if they take a piece of property from an undeveloped piece of property and put a city park in it, you got to get compensated for that, right? That's basic, the idea that if you take private property for a public purpose, you have to offer compensation to those people. Well, the far right in this country has for a long time wanted to put in place what's called regulatory takings, which is that, hey, if we pass a new living wage ordinance, or if we pass a new environmental regulation which affects your business model, then they've wanted to be compensated for that. Even the most right-wing Supreme Court in this country has consisted, although God, I hope there isn't one of those cases that comes right now, but at least up until this point, the U.S. Supreme Court has said absolutely not, that government can't function if it has to pay business every time a law affects their profits. And it's what NAFTA has essentially done has shifted all the risk onto the public. Now, the way it's supposed to be, and I say supposed to, that's obviously a normative statement, the way I think it's supposed to be is that people, investors, capitalists, should be wise about what they put their money into, and in this particular case, given that the St. Lawrence River had been the source of tremendous environmental opposition to industrial growth there for decades, that there was no question that it was a place where tremendous amounts of water existed for large populations, that the risk was on them, that if they didn't know that there was a possibility that they were going to have their business shut down because of that, then they're idiots, and that, anyhow, ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. But what they're saying is, no, the public should bear the risk of this. We're going to go ahead and do what we want. We expected profits on this, and because you have decided to, protect your water and make sure you don't all get cancer, we want to be paid $250 million. Now, they've been pretty clear about the fact that they don't actually want to finish this litigation under NAFTA. They want to settle. They want Quebec to back down and say, okay, fine, keep fracking. Because really, $250 million isn't that much. Now, granted, it makes me angry that the taxpayers of Canada would have to pay them not to poison the water. But at the end of the day, what Lone Pine Resources is hoping to do is to have them essentially back down because, anyhow, so if you're like me, you hear this and you say, what the fruit? How could that possibly be the way things are supposed to operate? And so this is, let's see, what did I, oh, wow. Oh, good, okay, it came out right here. So yeah, so the Council of Canadians is saying that it's obscene that these investor rights pacts like NAFTA allow private corporations to sue for expected future profits. Now the lawyer for Lone Pine, it's surprisingly honest here. He's saying this is exactly what NAFTA is supposed to do. And again, to go back to the sort of frame that I'm putting out there tonight, the idea is that government shouldn't be allowed to distort market outcomes. That's what the free trade regime says. And the lawyer for Lone Pine is essentially saying that's actually, that this is exactly what NAFTA was intended to do. So there's a couple of things hidden in here which I think bear mentioning, which is that traditionally, before NAFTA, there was never a time where an international dispute existed between anybody except country A and country B. Right? Those are the only people that signed NAFTA. Lone Pine didn't have any responsibilities under NAFTA. They didn't sign NAFTA. It should be Canada versus the US, if anything. NAFTA actually created a special judicial venue just for investors, transnational investors, to sue governments when they don't like what the governments are doing. So it's, the way I've been describing it is, it's a Citizens United for transnational businesses. This says not only do they have corporate personhood in domestic law, but we're going to give them nationhood under international law. This is some scary stuff. And in terms of the question of the relationship between the free trade regime and the climate regime, these investor protection provisions are used. 70% of the cases to date have been brought by oil, gas, and mining companies. The vast majority of time against developing countries. In this case, we have against a developed country. But imagine if you're Nicaragua and Nestle decides it doesn't like that you don't want them to privatize the water supply in Nicaragua. And they go ahead, lo and behold, Daniel Ortega actually does something for the people in his socialist approach to things. There's no chance that countries can do this. In fact, Canada overturned a ban on MMT, a known carcinogen that was a fuel additive. Canada MMT, and they got sued by a U.S. corporation under NAFTA, and they actually withdrew it and are allowing the use of MMT in fuel because they didn't want to pay the billions of dollars that it would have taken. And this is another step down the road. Not only are governments using free trade now to challenge climate policies, but you see something like fracking, tremendously concerning from a climate perspective, and private corporations are now being given the ability through the free trade regime to do this. So how do we get there? All of this essentially starts with NAFTA. What you had is the Reagan administration responding to substantial gains by social movements in the U.S. They were tremendously concerned about it. They were proponents of the idea of regulatory takings. And what they couldn't do in domestic law, they went ahead and wrote into international law. And yeah, Bush ultimately wrote NAFTA, and yes, Clinton ultimately sold it. But if you, and I don't mean to take any responsibility off of those two gentlemen, but my point is that the intellectual root of the free trade regime is with that guy right there. So if you know what he is about, then you know what the free trade regime is about. It was built as a delivery mechanism for a whole bunch of things that he couldn't do domestically, including allowing corporations to sue governments. So some pretty crazy stuff. So real quick, where are we at right now today? So well, let me just, so folks heard of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is another one of these NAFTA free trade agreements. These are all the countries that are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership talks. We have free trade agreements with a bunch of the countries already, so this is actually a consolidation agreement trying to create a large free trade bloc. It would ultimately be 40% of the global economy, so this is a substantial deal. Many people think this is in response to the fact that the WTO, we're actually doing really good at the WTO. The developing world is telling the EU, the US, and Japan and Canada that they can take a hike. They are not, the WTO is in utter, the WTO is going nowhere right now. They are legislating nothing at the WTO. The judicial system is kicking, doing well, unfortunately. But the WTO is going nowhere. And so the US is basically saying, well, we built this multilateral system in the WTO, but it's not working. We're not able to push what we want. And so they're taking the policies that they can't get through the WTO and creating these things like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, again, built on the NAFTA blueprint. Where does it come from? It comes from these guys. GW got the U.S. involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership towards the end of his second term. And candidate Obama said two things with respect to this, which he said, first, I'm going to renegotiate NAFTA. He said he was going to do that. He also said, candidate Obama said, I won't do TPP. He said, I'm going to withdraw the U.S. from the TPP. He was telling the labor unions, oh no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to forge a new path on international trade. There are 600 corporate advisors that actually will be in Singapore at the end of this month writing the rules to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Folks that are not going to be there, your fine senator, despite the fact that he is the head of the highest chamber of folks in DC that are supposed to represent the population. He doesn't know what's in the TPP. He can't read the text to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Meanwhile, 600 corporate representatives are actually writing the rules. This lady, not in the room. She's tremendously concerned about what this means for financial regulation. Talk about government intervention in the economy, right? Re-regulating the banks. This is essential. They caused this collapse, and now we're trying to say, actually, maybe the market forces don't work so well. She's tremendously concerned about what the TPP means for much of the financial regulation. Folks that are in the room, all the folks that you would expect to be in the room. In fact, the gentleman who represents the U.S. in these negotiations, Froman, who's the United States Trade Representative, it's an executive office position, much like the head of the EPA or something like that, actually comes from Citigroup. That's where he comes from, so you can imagine what perspective he brings. From what we know of what's in the TPP, there's a whole bunch of stuff in the TPP. As I said, what Reagan created with NAFTA, or what he imagined with NAFTA, and what Bush and Clinton finalized for him, was a delivery mechanism for a whole bunch of things that have nothing to do with trade. So you'll hear, if you hear Lori Wallach or any of the heavy hitters in this country who know about trade and actually get interviewed on the media and whatnot, you'll hear her say that the TPP isn't about trade. Well, it's a little bit about trade. There are 5 chapters in the TPP that are about trade. And then there are 4 chapters that have to do with dispute settlement and whatever else. But that means that the vast majority of ink, like quite literally, the vast majority of ink on the TPP is going to be about things like intellectual property. So the Congress rejected the Stop Online Piracy Act. Well, guess where the Stop Online Piracy Act is now at? It's in the intellectual property chapter of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Quite literally, the rules that Congress rejected in SOPA are in the intellectual property. And we know this because a leak. No, this wasn't through WikiLeaks. This is actually Darrell Issa leaked the intellectual property chapter because he was so concerned about it and because he really loves to embarrass Barack Obama. The investment rules down at the bottom, your bottom right, that's exactly like the Chapter 11 case. The Lone Pine Resources case, exact same thing. So they are replicating, and we know this because it was leaked through WikiLeaks. The environmental chapter was leaked recently through WikiLeaks. And actually is a step backwards from what George W. Bush negotiated. It quite literally is a step backwards on trade. Michael Brune had, in the press release, said that if the TPP's environment chapter were finalized as we saw in the leaked documents, it would mean that Barack Obama's record on environmental trade is worse than George W. Bush's. It is a step backwards. So the TPP is just another example of this stuff. NAFTA on steroids, WTO on steroids, whatever you want to call it, is not good. I think I've made my case pretty strong that we need the government to get in there and do some stuff. I'm not a big government fan, but in this case, where there is only one other option, either we let the market do whatever it's going to do, and we've seen market failure, we need someone to step in and start doing something. That's what we need the government to do on climate change. It isn't going to be pretty. I don't expect that it's going to be pretty. I'm willing to make some sacrifices in creating alliances with folks that I might not agree with on whether or not we should create wilderness. But if what we need to do is create a bunch of jobs in order to get climate legislation, then heck yeah, let's do it. I actually think it's a pretty good idea for a whole host of other reasons. But the point is that the trade regime is a real obstacle in the way of putting in comprehensive climate legislation. And so climate conversation number 2, that's it. So we'll chat. You had your hand up?
Oh no, you answered it.
Yes. The idea that telling people where something is grown, like so that there's the idea of country of origin labeling even. The WTO has a campaign called Made in the World. Because that's really informative. But yeah, they don't like the idea that, because they know that we want food from our state, from our county. We want local food. In fact, the WTO ruled against the dolphin safe label. The idea that your tuna should be caught in a way that doesn't kill dolphins. The WTO has 3 times ruled against the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is what the U.S. has used to identify tuna as dolphin safe. And most recently, they actually specifically ruled against the label, and it's a very convoluted case. But at the end of the day, what they said is yeah, we don't want consumers to be informed, which is utterly frustrating, because it's a basic assumption of free markets is that consumers have total information, and that it's an assumption that you know everything about what you're buying. So the idea that the WTO is standing up against those. Now, in terms of whether or not the WTO is going to come in here and close you down, they are not. What the WTO could do is impose sanctions if some challenge were to happen about local food or labeling, like GMO labeling, another example of something that the WTO is tremendously concerned about. They don't want countries to be putting in GMO labels or states to be putting in GMO labels. But the way that the trade regime enforces its rules is they put sanctions on it. So the U.S. would then have to pay some astronomical amount of money to the countries that were losing out by not being able to sell you, the pears or the peppers or whatever else that they grow in their country. So far as I know, there hasn't been a challenge to the Clean Water Act, but there's been numerous challenges to the Clean Air Act, and under the same idea, yeah, that government, what we think of is as addressing externalities, market failures, right? The idea that pollution is just being dumped into, the commons and whatnot, the place where we expect our government, which really is supposed to be us, but where we expect our government to come in. There's a number of instances where our efforts to clean up gasoline emissions and whatnot, dealing with the externalities associated with gasoline emissions, have been ruled illegal trade barriers. That's one of my biggest concerns about the investor protection rules is that if you're Sri Lanka or Nicaragua or Vietnam and you're trying to put in place a Clean Water Act, which they're not, but there are plenty of environmentalists and environmental justice communities there that would like for that to happen and are trying to do that. All of a sudden, the threat of having to pay $2 billion to the coal industry because you want to have a Clean Air Act is a non-starter, and it gives industry and it gives the folks that are opposed to that yet another argument for saying that we shouldn't do it. So it's tremendously concerning for folks in the developed world that already have a pretty robust labor and environmental system in place. But boy, if you're trying to put that in place, and most of the corporations that operate in your country are from elsewhere, you better be concerned. It's really hard for countries to disobey because, like I said, I mean it's a coercive regime whereby you suffer economic sanctions if you fail to comply with the rulings that these bodies issue. So it's a really, you know, and it's really, there's only one other body in the world that has that coercive power. It's the UN Security Council. I mean, the rest of, you know, international environmental law, there's no enforcement mechanism by and large. There's a few that have some. But so where we're at today with the TPP is that Baucus and Camp have proposed a fast-track legislation. What fast-track legislation is it essentially suspends all the normal legislative procedures whereby things are referred to committee and then the committees write the legislation and then they send it to the floor for a vote. What fast-track says is, hey, President Obama, go negotiate whatever you want. And it has some, you know, most of the time the fast-track legislation has some negotiating objectives in it, but it's non-binding, so we haven't seen executives bring back trade agreements that have met those requirements. But it says, hey, go negotiate with those other countries. And Barack Obama will actually put his signature on the Trans-Pacific Partnership before Congress ever gets to take a look at it. Quite literally, it will be signed, sealed, before it gets delivered to Congress. And then Congress will pretend to consider it. They'll actually hold mock markups. So rather than actual committee hearings where they debate whether or not this sentence makes sense or how to create a particular incentive for this industry or whatever else, they'll hold mock markups. And then they have to go up or down vote in both houses. And so right now, and I said there'd be some good news, 3/4 of the House Democrats have said they have no intention of voting for fast track for the Trans-Pacific Partnership. 3/4 of the House Democrats have said that. That is huge, and I think that, I don't know that I get any credit for it, but the freshman class of the last couple of election cycles has been amazing. People jumping on the fair and responsible trade bandwagon that our committee has, you know, has been pushing. In many cases, without even having to ask. We've actually received calls from offices saying, hey, could you try to put a little pressure on us so that we look like we're responding to our constituents? I mean, these are people who are leading on this now. Today, Nancy Pelosi said she will not support the Baucus-Camp legislation. Harry Reid last week said he has no intention of putting the Camp-Baucus legislation on the floor for a vote. So we're in a situation right now where we've never seen, before there's even, the TPP isn't done being negotiated, the committee hearings haven't even happened. I mean, we're just talking about Baucus and Camp putting forward legislation. It hasn't even been heard in committee yet, and already we have a substantial number of Democrats stepping up, including hot people in leadership positions, saying, we're not going to do this anymore. Now I don't want to be Pollyannish about it. There's a ton of wiggle room that Reid and Pelosi have left themselves in the positions that they've taken. But the fact that we're at a point where we have this level of opposition to a Democratic president, right? I mean, is really heartening. I mean, we've never been in this position before. I mean, I've been doing this for 12 or 15 years, and this is incredible. So what I've been doing in California, I do almost all my work in California, is we've got a few Democrats who are holding out, and we're just doing everything we can with the Sierra Club, and the Sierra Club's working really closely with the Communications Workers of America and the AFL-CIO and the Teamsters, and all the various 350.org groups, and putting as much pressure as we can to try to keep this from going. And if Fast Track is not voted for, you will never see TPP. It's a weird win. This is working in the trade world sucks because we win by nothing happening, which is like not something that helps activists get excited about things. But that's what happens because they won't bring a trade agreement to the floor and lose in a vote. They don't have the votes, they aren't going to bring it. So the way we win is by keeping them from even bringing it up. And if we beat Fast Track, then the expectation is that the other countries won't continue to negotiate because there's no chance that they're going to even bring it to a vote. So it's unfortunate that 4 years of our taxpayer dollars have gone into negotiating this thing, but I'd rather we not put a 5th year worth of our dollars into negotiating it. And right now, every other country that's been negotiating this is looking at President Obama and going, you know, WTF, man, what's going on here? So I think we're in a really good position. And the other thing I'll say in terms of a good position is we have seen a ton of new groups join the trade fight against the TPP that have never been with us before. The American Lung and Heart Association, because tobacco regulation, classic example of government intervention in the economy. We're distorting outcomes that otherwise wouldn't be there. And the WTO has been used to rule against certain tobacco regulations in the US. In 2011, I think, we lost a case at the WTO against that. So there's just been a groundswell of new groups getting involved, and you're seeing that actually represented in Congress. So it's working slowly, but it's working. Yeah. It's hard once there's the sort of cultural expectation is that everyone should be pro-free trade. So as soon as you're not pro-free trade, you get labeled by most folks as, you know, protectionist or at the very least biased. But yeah, the Center for Economic and Policy Research, it's a left-leaning think tank, but they have a bunch of analysis about what NAFTA has really meant for the US economy, for the Mexican economy. They have some analysis on World Trade Organization stuff, and I think they do a really good job.
What is that name again?
Center for Economic Policy and Research, CEPR, CEPR.org, I think it is. The Sierra Club site, by the way, is sierraclub.org/trade. And I think Ilana Solomon, who's the trade representative, the staff person, by the way, for folks who came in late, I'm not a Sierra Club staffer, I'm a volunteer. But our staff person is awesome. She does an amazing job, and she has some really good information up. In terms of what you might consider unbiased, you know, I don't know. I mean, the Public Citizen, the woman who runs the Public Citizens International Trade Division, a woman named Lori Wallach, is just incredibly brilliant, and her shop puts out amazing work and analyzing this stuff. But everybody would, you know, Project Censored. Yeah, they do an annual. It's kind of like an award, but they basically highlight issues that they think are critical social issues that the mainstream media is just utterly failing to cover, and trade regularly makes it onto their things that they're concerned. You know, what the Democrats have been saying for the last, I don't know, 10 years or so has been they want enforceable labor and environmental standards, which is great, and it would be good for there to be enforceable labor and environmental standards. But at the end of the day, the basic trajectory that these agreements are pushing the economy is not in the direction that environmentalists and labor unions want to see. And so it certainly would be an improvement, but when you have investor protection rules that allow corporations to file suit when they don't like it, I don't care how great your environmental language is. All the environmental rules say, and the labor rules say, and this is a gross summary of it, but they basically say, don't violate your own law. It doesn't say hey, Mexico, write a bunch of cool environmental laws and enforce them. It just says, don't violate the environmental laws that you have in place. So when you tell Thailand, hey, don't violate the environmental laws you have in place, and don't violate the labor laws you have in place, you're really not doing that much. Even if it's an enforceable part of the agreement, it's a pretty low bar to be asking folks. And especially when developing countries can get out of enforcing their laws by saying, well, we don't have enough money to have officers out there monitoring water or making sure that 6-year-olds aren't making soccer balls in the dark. They can get out of it by saying, well, we prioritized other things. Then they don't get in any trouble. So even the best of enforceable language is going to include a ton of wiggle room, and often is pretty darn weak. And so it's nice that all the Democrats know that line now. If you go to any member of Congress, they'll tell you, oh, well, I'm for labor and environmental standards and trade agreements. It's like, well, that's great, but I don't think you really get what we're talking about here. So anyhow, yeah, and the text looks good in certain cases. All the way in the back?
Well, I mean, of course, there's the official statement, and then there's unofficially what they actually do. And if you really look at where this whole thing started, it started with shock economics, and Ronald Reagan really was the voice piece for the entities that wanted this thing, that started. And really, I mean, one of the big things is, because it's a corporate thing now, is it's all about, ultimately, when they put the pressure in saying, well, if you don't allow us to do what we want to do, then the government has got to pay us. But who is the government? Doesn't matter what country it is, the government is the people. And they're the ones who need to fund all those penalties. Well, when you add in, doesn't matter here, we're saying things are controlled. I can't answer for a lot of other countries. But so much of what people can't fight against corporate tyranny in this country is because it's built into the Commerce Clause. And the Commerce Clause always funnels it back down into a place that always forces the people to have to keep fighting it when they really ultimately can't fight it except in really small exceptions. So ultimately it's always about bringing it back to everybody around the world has to pay for corporations, and they have to pay for it in tax exemptions, they have to pay for it in giving them tax deferrals, they have to pay for it in all the subsidies, all allowing corporations to do what they want to do on the taxpayer's back. And then on top of that, which a lot of people don't know, is that if there is anything goes wrong, like the St. Lawrence, if they allow them to go ahead and frack, and you have all this gas bubbling up, and the water's on fire, and it destroys people's water, who pays for that? They've already written it in that if something happens based upon what we do, it doesn't matter whether it's mining, it doesn't matter whether it's fracking, it doesn't matter whether it's oil, it doesn't matter what the hell it is. Ultimately, people have to pay for the cleanup. And there's only so much that people can afford, because if they have to keep paying for it, what happens? The government comes back and says, you have to pay more in taxes. You have to make up for it here. The way they can do it on the co-op is not just labeling, they will force the cost so great that co-ops can't afford. People can't afford to go to a co-op. They'll go to a place where the money's less. So ultimately, this is always about people, you're either going to pay us now or you're going to pay us later.
Investor protection rules are a classic just risk shifting. I mean,
Right,
from an
exactly.
economist's perspective, it's just a risk shift where it's where we generally think the appropriate place on the for risk to be placed is on the businesses. You operate, you know, we live in a society, not in an economy, right? We live in society, and we want a healthy economy, but we ultimately live in society. And so generally the way we think of it is that the business bears the risks for societal changes, and society changes. But what these things do is they shift the burden, and they say, no, business is just going to make its plans, and when society shifts, they're going to have to pay. Yeah, so there has been legislation introduced in the House and the Senate, I think, for, I'm not sure if Senator Brown did it in the Senate. Anyhow, the House has considered something called the Trade Act for at least the last 3 sessions, and it's the Trade Reform and Accountability Development, I don't know, they came up with something that spelled trade. Anyhow, the Trade Act is some legislation that the first thing it says is no new NAFTAs, no new negotiations. First thing is pause, press pause. Next, let's create some committees to review existing trade agreements. What was promised? What have the actual outcomes been? And then it's developing core standards for all trade agreements. So Congress would actually say, we want the enforceable labor and environmental provisions. One of the things we've asked for in what the Trade Act suggests is no investor to state dispute settlement. If Lone Pine has a problem with Canada's actions, take it up with the State Department. And if the State Department thinks it's appropriate, fine. Then it'll be country A versus country B. No more corporation A against country B. And then revise existing agreements based upon what we learned, right? Because we've been promised so much. Every time there's a new trade agreement, the Korea agreement is a classic one. Oh, we're going to export. This is a strong, growing economy in South Korea. We're going to export a whole bunch of more goods. It's going to make jobs for the United States. No. Exports are down 10%. Imports are up like 30%. The trade deficit is growing with South Korea since we passed the free trade agreement with them. It's like 40,000 US jobs have been lost. So what was promised, what's actually there. Now let's revise agreements based upon what we've learned and what Congress has said they want. Because again, the way fast track legislation allows all these trade agreements to work is the executive gets to do whatever the heck it wants. So this reasserts congressional role in writing the trade agreements. Then it says Congress gets to decide what countries we negotiate trade agreements with. It's hilarious. You look at the countries we've negotiated trade agreements with, Oman, Peru, Central America, You think these are going to create American jobs? No, the State Department is running that. Those are part of a geopolitical strategy. That's not part of an economic strategy. That's not part of a trade strategy. So the other thing the Trade Act says is Congress gets to pick and choose which countries does it make strategic economic sense to negotiate trade agreements with, and then proceed. So there is legislation, and in many ways I think of it, to some extent it's procedural, right? Like, if you leave Halliburton, Chevron, and Citigroup by themselves to write a trade agreement, you pretty much know what they're going to do, right? But if you leave the Sierra Club by ourselves to write a trade agreement, well, I don't think we're going to do such a good job. The environment's going to do well, but trade might not do so. To some extent, the solution to this, the alternative to this, is a procedural solution. What we need to do is create a balanced group of interests that together can write trade policy. And so that's what the Trade Act says. It says, let's stop what we're doing, let's get a good handle on where things are at, pick countries that are appropriate for negotiating, and then proceed from there. I think that's the elevator conversation, that's right. Ditch TPP, no more NAFTAs, until we get a better sense of how this is working. And I want Trade Act is and I want Congress to decide who we negotiate trade agreements with. Even just selecting trading partners would be huge, because there'd be some implicit goals in what countries got selected. So the Constitution actually places the role of arranging trade commerce with foreign nations in the House of Representatives, But Fast Track has consistently advocated that to the executive branch. So yeah, so that's the elevator conversation with Wyden. No new NAFTAs. TPP is ridiculous. We shouldn't have to depend on something as, if trade is as important as you say it is, why are we depending on WikiLeaks to find out what's in our trade agreements?
And not only that, doesn't Ron Wyden, he's in favor of Fast Track, isn't he?
No, he doesn't have a position. He has been tremendously and vocally critical of the lack of transparency in the TPP process, and he has been for at least 2 years. He's been out and saying, you can't just do this behind closed doors. You can't expect people to just trust you given what we've already seen. There is a small but vocal element in the far right of the Republican Party, the Tea Party folks, who see this as the global government that everyone is always saying the UN is. This is the global government. These are the folks that are actually coercing governments to do things that they don't want to do. So there's a real strong conservative argument against this, which is that this is the antithesis of states' rights. This is not the Jeffersonian vision of states being the experiment, the laboratories of democracy. This is the opposite of that. These are global institutions commanding states to do what they say. So there's it's pretty weird when you get the Sierra Club and Michelle Bachmann in together on something. There is I think a growing Republican constituency and group of legislators that are concerned about what this ultimately means. For very different reasons, but I don't know, maybe not very different reasons, right? We're concerned about the ability of governments to act in the public interest. Now, we will disagree with Michelle Bachmann about what should be done in the public interest, but the fundamental idea is that governments shouldn't be forced by international institutions to do something that the people they represent don't want. Without Fast Track, you don't conclude the TPP negotiations. So Japan isn't going to put their final best proposal on the table until they know whether or not there's actually going to be a vote in Congress. And without Fast Track, there will be no vote in Congress. So NAFTA was part of a larger strategy, right? NAFTA was not the end game. The end game was the free trade area of the Americas. The goal was a NAFTA that stretched from North America all the way to the tip of South America. But we beat that because we beat Fast Track, and it morphed, right? It didn't go away necessarily. So I wouldn't want to say that the TPP disappears. It will change shape, right? So we didn't get the free trade area of the Americas, but we got a free trade agreement with Chile and with Peru. We got the Central America Free Trade Agreement. We got the Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement. So it's being piecemealed. So you're right, the pressure continues on this. But what the sense is, and people far smarter than I are the folks that suggest this, and so I trust them. The idea is that once NAFTA blueprint is no longer viable in Congress, then the question of, well, what are we gonna do now? That's what we wanna get to. That's when the Trade Act becomes, when you get Ron Wyden and you get, you know, some of the folks that are strong labor and environmental supporters in a position where they can help direct this instead of it being an exclusively executive branch thing, that what comes out of that may not be something that the Sierra Club ultimately supports, but it will look a whole lot better than this. So the idea is that if you can kill a free trade agreement and demonstrate to the world that the U.S. Congress isn't going to do this anymore, then you force a reappraisal of the strategy. And it won't go away. I mean, you know, Halliburton and Chevron and Citigroup will sit down again and try to figure out what to do. The goal is that when they ultimately sit down to write the law, that the Sierra Club's at the table, that the AFL is at the table, you know, that the table includes enough people that they can't be doing these back-end deals and creating a delivery mechanism for their, you know, their ultimate goals. Right now, I mean, I think generally it's thought that the fast-track battle is fought in the House and not the Senate. But I think for folks in this room, the future of where this goes will in no small part be on Senator Wyden. He will be controlling the Senate's agenda on trade through the Finance Committee. So phone calls into his office saying, you know, replace fast track with fair and responsible, you know, trade. Co-sponsor the Trade Act, move the Trade Act through the Senate. Those kinds of things are really important. Thanking DeFazio for being someone who tends to, and I don't, again, I'm a California-centric guy, so I don't really know all the ins and outs of that. But if you have a Congress member that's good, thank them for being good and tell them that you think that we're at a point where we might be able to start a new conversation about trade, and you know, tell them to be strong or whatever else. And members that haven't taken a position against fast track, we need public positions against fast track. And it's really a limited ask. People hate to, you know, Congress members hate to take positions on things publicly before there's a vote. But 3/4 of the House Democrats are already out on this. Pelosi and Reid are already out on this. You're not really asking them to like walk the plank or anything. You're asking them to like join the club. Like all they have to be is sheep at this point. They don't have to be leaders. They just have to get on board with what everyone else is asking for. So there's a website called citizenstrade.org, citizens with an S at the end of it, citizenstrade.org, and they have a link or a section at the top called Take Action, and you just put in your zip code, and it will bring up a form to your member of Congress about fast track, and that literally will take you 2 minutes. Really, really easy stuff.